Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Managing Memorials and Anniversaries as a part of overall school and higher ed safety planning webinar. This webinar is hosted by your partners at the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Safe and Supportive Schools, formerly known as the Office of Safe and Healthy Students, and its REMS TA Center. Before we start, I'd like to provide a quick housekeeping note. Please ensure your computer speakers are turned off for the duration of the event. And if you experience any technical difficulties, you can request TA using the Q&A feature on your screen. You can also email the REMS TA Center at info@remstacenter.org if you're not able to access the Q&A feature. Also, we have provided a few web links for you on the left-hand side of your screen. And we hope that you download them and use them later and throughout the event as reference materials. To ask a question during the Q&A portion of this webinar, you can use, again, that Q&A pod on your screen, and that message will come to our webinar facilitator. You can pose questions at any time during the event, although we will answer them at the end as time permits. We also encourage you to join us for 30 minutes following this webinar for a web chat that we will host on the REMS TA Center Community of Practice, and we'll take additional time during that chat to answer questions that we weren't able to answer during the live event. I'd like to start by introducing myself and my co-presenters for today. I am the Deputy Project Director for the REMS TA Center, and we work in partnership with the Office of Safe and Supportive Schools to execute the mission of the TA Center and to fulfill the department's goals to assist schools, IHEs, and their partners in building their safety, security, and emergency management programs. I'm also joined by my colleague, Madeline Sullivan, who is a management and program analyst at the Department of Education's Office of Safe and Supportive Schools. And she wears many hats, leading a coordinated federal effort on school preparedness, as well as administering the REMS TA Center. We are also joined by two awesome experts in the field. Michelle Gay is the co-founder and executive director of Safe and Sound Schools. Following the tragic loss of her daughter, Josephine, in the Sandy Hook school tragedy, Michelle joined Sandy Hook mother Alyssa Parker to establish Safe and Sound Schools as a national resource for school safety. Michelle travels across the country sharing her message of inspiration, recovery, and school safety education and advocacy. She conducts school safety workshops and seminars, presenting Safe and Sound school safety model and resources, and facilitating school safety development in communities across the country. Christina Anderson is the founder and executive director of the Koshka Foundation for Safe Schools. She is an international advocate in the fields of bystander intervention, active shooter response, and violence prevention within schools, workplaces, and public spaces. She is the founder, again, of the Koshka Foundation, which is a nonprofit that provides training on the prevention of school and workplace violence, education on active shooter preparedness, and consultation on post-crisis recovery. She travels extensively within the country to spread the importance of preparedness and joint training between citizens, educators, law enforcement, emergency managers, and of course, first responders. Christina started the nonprofit after becoming one of the most critically injured survivors of the 2007 Virginia Tech school tragedy, where she was shot 3 times. We are excited to welcome Michelle, Christina, and Madeline to join this webinar today. Let's take a moment to look at the agenda. We'll start by providing an overview of the importance of developing a trauma-informed approach to planning. We'll then turn things to Christina and Michelle to talk about some of their lessons learned relating to memorializing anniversaries. The REMS TA Center will then spend some time discussing the importance of integrating this topic into overall emergency operations plan. And then we'll all spend a little bit of time talking about managing donations and volunteers as a part of this process. And then, of course, we'll provide an opportunity for you to ask any questions of our presenters that we have here today. And with that, I'll turn things to my colleague, Madeline Sullivan, to set up the topic. Madeline?
Thank you, Janelle, and welcome everyone. We're happy to have you. So schools, their mission, as we all know, is teaching and learning and to promote achievement. To do so, schools must have a positive environment that is conducive to teaching and learning. It's an environment where students feel welcomed, they feel a sense of membership, and they feel supported. So we want to be engaging our students academically in ways that promote their use of their critical thinking skills, as well as their bodies, so that they can best learn collectively as a class and individually as a student. And so that means we're tapping into the whole student, body, mind, and spirit. And so all of those faculty must be open and available for engagement in order to do teaching and learning. The environment that's conducive to learning can be interrupted by a traumatic event. A traumatic event, particularly one that a child or an adolescent experiences as threatening or dangerous, can prompt the amygdala. It's the part of the brain, it's in the limbic system. And this is the body's alarm system, or its response. It sets off the response to fear. So these response results typically in what's often referred to as a flight or fight response. And young people may become either confrontational or avoidant, or other words, they might shut down. With that, they might be misinterpreting cues in the environment, or they themselves might be creating a hostile attribution bias, so their feelings of fear is going to interfere with their meaningful reactions to the environment stimuli. And this often results, unintentionally, in aggression or withdrawal. So with that, again, they might shut down. Either response, they're not open for teaching and learning when they're in that trauma phase or that shock post-trauma. So we can look at the different possible reactions to trauma, and we can think about them in terms of a number of different categories, such as emotional behaviors, behavioral reactions, cognitive behaviors and reactions, as well as the psychological ones. So when we talk about emotions and feelings, we might have students and staff, especially children, who feel an increased sense of worry and fear. And this is going to be showing itself in relationship to a number of situations, including separation from their loved ones. And also, this might be, it'll show itself in the separation, but the children might be feeling a sense of fear in an ongoing situation, or they might be fearing that the event might happen again. And with that, they have a sense of helplessness. So in terms of behavioral reactions, or ways we might see it in school and at home and in the community, at school we might see students, their attendance might change. Or they might be late. We're going to see their academic performance change. So they might not be able to stay on task, complete assignments, or understand directions, and might need to request, or as a teacher, we might need to be sensitive to that and provide directions multiple times or in multiple formats. At home, we might see them sleeping less or very different schedules and such. We could see a change in their appetite or even just in their general moods. So we might see them being more irritable. And then we also need to remember the cognitive aspects of it. So young children might pose repeated questions about the event or repeat the same questions, or pose questions so that they can better understand the event. And then they might ask others to tell them about the event, even if they were part of it. This is their efforts to better understand. So with that, we might see them showing an increased attention in media or discussions on it. But we also have to remember that throughout this, they might be exposed to reminders. So things that are similar to the event or that were, a major part of that event to the individual. So it might even be sounds or smells, or even a particular kind of movement or the sky. So we have to just be really compassionate to, it's something personal that might prompt their reaction. And lastly, we need to really keep in mind those psychological reactions. So we might see our kids and our peers being generally more startled by everyday occurrences. We also might see a lot of somatic complaints. So things that are that someone feels, but they're not necessarily detectable by others. So thinking about those headaches and the stomach aches, and then also we have the general fatigue all the time. So as teachers, as school administrators, and as families supporting students, we need to remember that when we see all of these things, we need to have it prompt our outlooks and have us think, oh, this is a sign of trauma. So it's not necessarily a negative behavior. Instead, it's a behavior or communication that we could recognize as a sign that a child needs support due to the trauma. So a number of things, a number of different types of emergency events could happen to cause trauma in a child. So whether it's a natural hazard or a human-caused threat, or even some of the biological and technical hazards and threats, it can be traumatic and certainly have a negative impact on children. So we need to remember that these emergencies, these crises, they're born of loss and bereavement and grief, and they can happen to an individual student in the school community, a class in the school community, or even an entire school, or it might even be an event that was shared community-wide. But also remembering that just because we weren't a part of that traumatic event, some of the feelings and trauma associated with it might still be shared by that community. So when we're looking and working and supporting students, we have to remember that maybe there's trauma they're feeling that we're not aware of. So trauma may also be the result of exposure and even the possibility of an event after exposure. So for example, someone might be sheltering during a tornado and they might survive and without injury or harm. However, the trauma comes from going through it and not knowing the outcome and not knowing that they're going to go through this experience without injury and they will survive. And not knowing if your loved ones are going to survive as well. So these traumatic impacts can spread to more than just these individuals who experience it. And this is especially true for those who are in helping roles or have that type of relationship with one of the persons in the event. And so this brings up the topic of compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is that cumulative physical, emotional, and psychological effect of exposure to traumatic events and or stories in the workplace, and then pardon me, and that coupled with that personal life stress, it can cause people to become fatigued. It's important to remember that not only will students be impacted by these events, but staff can also experience the trauma as well. In addition to experience the direct effects of an emergency event, staff can also experience compassion fatigue, or otherwise known as secondary traumatic stress, due to this indirect exposure to other people's traumatic experiences. So staff and other volunteers can also experience the vicarious trauma due to their continuous exposure to victims of trauma and violence. Vicarious trauma is the emotional residue of exposure that counselors have from working with people, in this case students and staff, as they're hearing their traumatic stories and becoming witnesses to the students' pain, fear, and terror that trauma survivors have endured. Okay, so once schools understand the impacts of trauma on students and family and staff, on that whole school community, they can begin to recognize and respond by delivering trauma-informed care. Ultimately, the goal is to create that safe and supportive environment that is conducive to teaching and learning for the whole school community before, during, and after a possible emergency. It's this foundation of trauma-informed care upon which plans for handling memorials and commemorating anniversaries can be developed. The planning team at a trauma-informed school can conduct trauma-informed planning to provide that support and to avoid re-traumatizing the school or the higher ed community or its individual members. Our guest presenters today, they're going to share with you these concepts and examples of trauma-informed memorials and anniversary commemorations momentarily. For those of you who would like more information on trauma-informed care, I'm going to share with you some resources. Okay, so first we're going to begin with a poll question. So what trauma-informed practices does your school or school district or institution of higher ed currently include in your emergency management planning or safety programs? So please type in your answer, and the more answers we get, the better of a conversation we can have, and the better we can tailor the rest of our presentation to you. So again, is anyone familiar with ways that your school or school district, whether it's higher ed or K through 12, considers trauma and tries to work in compassion to their teaching and learning environment, whether it be in the classroom setting or maybe a school-wide setting such as the campus or cafeteria or even assemblies? And so I see someone says none and another person has a plan. They say they don't have a plan. So ultimately, yeah, we want to be incorporating that compassion throughout everything we do. And so how about, can you think of times where you do have some things in place? So maybe is it understood that it's okay to send a child to the nurse's office if they just need some quiet time? Or is it understood that students can go to the library if they need some quiet time or time alone to do their academics? Oh, wow. So someone here is talking about their district-wide crisis team, and they use the framework of the multi-tiered system of interventions and support to help identify those who have needs for that kind of support. And others use mental health staff to provide direct support. And we have a counseling centers as another one. Oh, and we have another one, a group that has a whole team that's been trained with this sort of skill. So thank you, everyone. That's very good to hear. And so we hope that you will stay engaged with the REMS TA Center and our presenters today, and so that we can share more examples as we start to better integrate and inform everyone on the topic. Okay. So I am now going to turn us over to our guest that we're very honored to have, Christina.
Thank you, Madeline. Hello, everyone. It's really an honor to be with you today, and thank you for taking the time and sharing those answers. It's really wonderful to see all the different practices and trainings that you're having. Just briefly as an introduction before we jump into more of our slides, one thing that I'm sure many of you in this community from planning, and I have some survivors as well on the webinar today, is the understanding that you'll hear pretty often that recovery is a marathon and not a sprint. And so while some things that I'll talk about in a few minutes, pertain to our immediate recovery and long-term care, it's the understanding, as Madeline mentioned, that being trauma-informed means that, manifestations of trauma or grief or loss and sadness can manifest at any point and any time, and not only in the first, 3 or 4 or 6 months. And so one of the most important things to do, as many of you mentioned that you already are thinking about, is having mental health providers and training in place, and thinking about, a few months prior to an anniversary, what type of assistances and resources are going to be there. One of the things that we've encountered and I've experienced is sometimes there is this perceived awkwardness that we may not understand someone's grief, or we don't feel that we are able to answer and speak to their experience. And so somebody just providing training for faculty and staff and talking points of, if you don't feel comfortable to do so, here are appropriate referrals or places that one can be shared to. And it takes planning and leadership to do that. And just being careful, which we'll speak about a little bit as well later, of our language, and not to say things like, oh, you know, why aren't you already over it, or you weren't at school or work that day. Just being very cognizant that everyone is a survivor of these different, crises, and that we must be open to everyone's experience, and it is our responsibility to plan and to respond for those. So really just kind of trying to hone in on that mental health aspect, and being able to say, I may not be the best person for you, but I'm aware of community resources that are. And I think Michelle wanted to share a little bit with us as well on the next slide. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback on everything that you shared there, Christina. Hi everyone. It's a real honor to be here with this community today, tackling some really timely discussion about being trauma informed and what that means. And to Christina's point, having that common language among us all. I think what I'm going to share with you here, you can see this visual. We call it a spectrum of trauma preparedness at Safe and Sound Schools. And this is something that we just recently developed, and I'm sure it'll continue to evolve as all things do with us. But it came out of a discussion that we were having internally about what it means to be trauma informed. It's kind of a buzzword these days, and you hear a lot of communities talking about it, and talking about trauma-informed training, and so we were discussing what does that really mean, and how do we determine if a community is truly trauma-informed. So out of our discussion, we kind of began breaking it down and looking at it in terms of a journey, right? The ideal for us is to get our communities to the point where they can actually be trauma resilient, but the reality is that many of us are beginning from a place of being unaware, or perhaps we are just beginning to become aware that trauma is living and walking around every day in our community, and presenting in various ways, as Christina was talking about, as Madeline was talking about. There can be people in our community that present as very typical and normal and healthy, and yet they are carrying around with them some of these invisible scars and wounds. So just becoming aware of that is obviously foundational to this process. And then joining together in our community practice like this to have these discussions and learn from one another about trauma, about what it looks like, becoming informed, becoming educated, and becoming trained so that we can begin to become trauma sensitive. We can recognize trauma and the many manifestations of it around us in our school communities and our communities at large. And then continuing that work, continuing that training, continuing to build our resources and programs. You're going to hear a lot about great resources and programs that are out there, not just from Safe and Sound Schools or from Koshka. Obviously, a lot of great resources coming from REMS as well. The National Association of School Psychologists is a phenomenal resource with great models as well. For us, the National Resilience Institute is another great resource, and you can see all those resources here in the web link section of the webinar. But ultimately, moving along from responsiveness to a maintenance phase of continuing that growth, continuing to provide support in our communities so that we can be truly equipped to be trauma resilient with whatever form of crises may appear or present in our school communities. So just a little bit to provide the context of becoming trauma informed, becoming trauma prepared as a journey.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you so much, Christina, for sharing. And I think you both brought up excellent points as it relates to that cycle and that continuous spectrum of awareness that is required. And we always talk about the National Preparedness System mission areas that look at these different aspects of emergency preparedness planning, including protection, prevention, mitigation, response, and then also recovery. Memorials can serve an important function in the grieving and healing process, which of course is an important part of overall recovery. These events help recognize and honor those who lost their lives, the injured, survivors, community members, and all of those who supported the schools and the school communities and institutions of higher education during time. Anniversaries occur regardless of whether a school or institution of higher education chooses to commemorate them. And they can hold different significance for various school or IHE community members, and they can be observed in different ways by different people. And so we're looking forward to hearing some lessons learned from Michelle and Christina on managing and planning for those, and also how they supported the recovery process, because they are a part of emotional and psychological recovery, and plans for them should be included in the school or campus's recovery annex. Including them in the annex allows the planning team to develop procedures for managing expected and unexpected occurrences related to memorials and anniversaries. And Michelle shared some details about some resources that are available, and we have some here on the screen that provide additional information on the importance of having trauma-informed systems set up that think about all aspects of recovery, all aspects of preparedness, including prevention, protection, mitigation, and response as well. We encourage you to access those links and to download them, and to also join us for our Community of Practice web chat 30 minutes after this webinar, where we'll share additional resources and can answer additional questions about these topics. We're going to move now into our next portion of the webinar. We're going to have Christina Anderson and Michelle Gay share some of their lessons learned from memorializing anniversaries. We will kick things off with Michelle, who will share about her experiences, and then from there, Christina will carry on the conversation, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of integrating this topic in overall emergency management planning. Michelle?
Thank you for that, Janelle. I want to share, before I begin, obviously a lot of the resources and the lessons learned that I'll be sharing on the webinar today are available to our school communities through Safe and Sound Schools. You can learn more about us on the website. But more importantly, perhaps, just to know that there is a larger network out there that, helps to inform and create resources like the one that I just shared with you. Spectrum that we developed in consultation with Dr. Molly Marty of the National Resilience Institute and some of our colleagues over at NASP as well. So as I begin to share some of these lessons learned, and I'll try to do the best I can in the short time frame that we have, I just want to emphasize that I'll be sharing the perspective of one parent from one very unique traumatic event, the Sandy Hook school tragedy. We are a family. My family is a victim family, having lost our youngest child. We're also a survivor family, having had another child who was in the building and survived that day, and yet another child who was at another school campus in town. We're also a family that moved out of town 1 month after the tragedy. So our experience and our lens is absolutely unique, as is everyone's who is involved in any type of traumatic or crisis event. After our move as a family, we would go back to town. We did not move that far away. So we would go back for healing activities, meetings, and to be with our friends and neighbors. But we were living, a month after the tragedy in another nearby New England town in an environment of relative normalcy and anonymity. So that really did have an effect on our journey, and I think maybe even our ability to kind of observe the process that was going on in our home community of Newtown. When I think back to our community on December 14th, 2012, and I think of that spectrum that I laid out for all of you, we were very much on the early end of the spectrum, many of us in the unaware zone, some of us moving into the aware zone, and I think even for some of our leadership beginning to move into the informed point on the spectrum, and that is because we had just as a community come through two community-wide crises that kind of inadvertently prepared our leadership and mobilized some of our resources and volunteers in many ways, and led to, I think, the beginnings of a greater trauma awareness for some of our town leaders and our community overall. Those two crises were Hurricane Sandy, which actually, even though we weren't a coastal community, resulted in community-wide power outages, storm damages, road closings, things like that for an extended period of time in our town, school having been closed for about 2 weeks as well. And also a kind of a freak ice storm that happened in the fall as well, resulting in loss of power and storm damages and trees down as well. So as I said, those things prepared us in some ways for what we would face following the tragedy at the school. I think while many of us, were surrounded by incredible neighbors and friends and leaders to begin carving the path following the tragedy of December 14th, 2012. The main thing that I would like to share is that we hope, and I know Christina shares in this as well, that these conversations begin in your community today on a good day when the hurting isn't happening and there's time to become educated and trained and prepared. We were very much as a community kind of figuring it all out as we were going along. One of the first things that we began seeing, after having been initially struck by the tragedy on the day, Friday, December 14th, 2012, almost immediately, really that evening, the memorial process began in town, and we would learn later across the country. There were these immediate memorials that began showing up. The street corner memorials, as you see here in this photo, candles, stuffed animals, Christmas trees. This was obviously close to the winter holidays, to the Christmas holidays, so there were a lot of Christmas trees going up, beautiful memorials on people's yards and throughout the town. Balloons on mailboxes. Our daughter Josephine, who passed in the tragedy, her favorite color was purple. So, one morning we got up and all of the mailboxes on our street were decorated with purple mailboxes. Ribbons on trees, just beautiful gestures, powerful gestures of community members, neighbors, and friends throughout the town began to appear. I remember discussions about flags, should the flags be at half-mast? What are the protocols? And some, sort of debates and arguments happening around things like that. What should we be doing? What's the right thing to do? And I remember most of all just being so powerfully struck by the meaning of these memorials. They were so meaningful to victims' families, to see these everywhere in town, to let us know that people were praying for us, people were thinking of us, hurting alongside us. And also I think they were very, very important for the people who constructed them, the people who were dropping off various, stuffed animals and ornaments and works of art. They needed an outlet for their hurting and their sorrow, and they needed to be able to feel as though they were doing something that could help in some way. So, I would not ever underestimate or want to, overlook when communicating about memorials how very important some of those immediate memorials can be. As the days would go on, we would become aware of many published memorials as well. I think most of our families of loss were avoiding TV and media outlets for obvious reasons related to this discussion of trauma. But there were quite a lot of published memorials. There were iconic collages of each and every one of our precious loved ones that we lost that day in the tragedy, and all sorts of different publications, not just in magazines and newspapers, but also we were discovering online. There were Facebook pages being set up. There were memorial pages, memorial websites, and we would, as a family, only learn about these things later. I think our friends and neighbors and community members were kind of becoming aware of these things and sort of seeking to protect us from some of these difficult decisions. But ultimately, there would be a lot of these online memorials and Facebook pages that would be set up by likely very well-intended strangers, but people who didn't know us, didn't know our families, didn't know our loved ones, weren't even a part of our community. Again, probably just looking for some kind of outlet or to do something positive. But it would result in a lot of confusion and a lot of misinformation about our loved ones, and ultimately a lot of extra work to try to ask folks to take those things down. So something to be aware of when a crisis is large scale or public as ours was, unfortunately. But it was the beginning of having to ask, who determines how the deceased from a crisis or a tragedy and the survivors are remembered. There are also iconic photographs of many of our surviving children and staff members evacuating from the building, and those things, are utilized in media, in print to this day, and those have an effect on the individuals. Those pictures were taken, without their knowledge, without their consent, and those things have a long-lasting impact. So it's important to be aware of those. Initially, in the first couple weeks, probably the most important memorials, I think, in our community were those related to the services, the loved ones that we lost. I think there was a lot of focus in our community around honoring those that we lost first. So there were services and funerals. Our town was very much overtaken, I think, by visitors, by family members coming, by the media as well. So it was very challenging to manage all of that in our small town and to account for everyone's moving about town safely and making sure that people could even get from place to place within our community. We would also see in town there would be a lot of vigils, there would be a lot of even protests and posters and signs. Our loved ones were becoming these sort of unwilling poster children for various causes and initiatives in town and across the country. So this would be something that was very difficult for many of us during this time and even now in the many years following the tragedy. But some of the more positive things and unifying things in our community were things like motorcycle rides and 5Ks. There were concerts. There were visits from high-profile politicians and entertainers as well. Again, those would be incredibly challenging logistically and for our law enforcement that were seeking to protect us all through this journey. A lot of safety planning and logistics that surrounded a lot of those big events. There would also be some opportunities for us to look long-term at planned memorials, thinking about different ways that we account for the healing of the community as well. We were early on offered a donation from a large corporation to provide for a community center. And it would take years to plan this and come to consensus, but it has opened in town and exists as a gathering place for all of the community for a lot of our events, and really helping our community members to have a place to gather, to be together. And I want to say too, as we were collecting all of these things, and a lot of things were being sent without any solicitation or initial offer, they were just showing up. One thing that was important for us was learning how to say no thank you, learning how to say we just cannot take anymore, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the space, and at this moment in time we don't as a community have the energy and the resources to make these decisions. We're very much moving our way through a difficult healing process. So at this time, no thank you. And then beginning something that would be very important in terms of the long term and the planning would be planning a permanent memorial. So we would begin planning this memorial. We are only at the moment in time where we have chosen a site. It's taken us this long as we're approaching the 7-year anniversary. We've located a site. We have interviewed all of the various stakeholders and community members, survivors, responders, families of loss, all of the different stakeholders that you can imagine that would really and need to be a part of this decision. But we're still in the process of determining what it looks like and how we will fund it and all of those things. So some people, comment that they can't believe that we don't have our permanent memorial yet, but I would answer that to do it right, it really needs to be done over a period of time, where we are as a community today versus where we were, maybe 5 years ago is vastly different. So we've come a long way, and I think that will be reflected in that final product that will be our permanent memorial in town. We were receiving many things. Lots of things were coming our way, and the first anniversary was approaching, and I remember kind of simultaneously everyone having a lot of conversations about how we would handle this first anniversary, and also we still have these warehouses of donations and cards and things that have not been processed yet. So I remember our first selectman coming up with the idea of gathering all of these sort of leftover materials or materials that just didn't have a home yet and making the decision to incinerate them, but to save the ashes. And to save those ashes to be folded into the ground of our permanent memorial. And this was a decision that was made around that first anniversary mark, I remember, and one that really resonated with people and began to give us a sense for the journey ahead, for hope ahead. But marking the first anniversary is something that many of our communities really struggle with and worry about doing it right. And I think one thing that perhaps I would share, that Christina would share, and that I know many of our community members on the webinar today would probably agree with, is that there is no one right way. And each and every community is very different and very unique. Each and every tragedy or crisis is unique. So it really does need to be a process and a decision. One thing that I think comes up in a lot of these communities as the 1 year mark approaches is this an anniversary? Are we calling it an anniversary? Does that term fit for us? For many of us, the term remembrance, Day of Remembrance is preferred. Anniversary just doesn't necessarily feel right. So, words matter, and it's important to acknowledge the culture and sort of the consensus within your community about what you're even going to call these things, and whether they're going to be very low-key, as many of our activities were in Newtown, because that was what was mostly called for, or whether they're going to be more public, more grand in scale. It's completely up to that community. Acknowledging the anniversary at the school would be particularly challenging for us. Obviously, we had a range of age groups in schools. We had elementaries, we had an intermediate, a middle, and a high. And, each of those age groups had various, levels of knowledge and understanding about what had happened. So we really had to put a lot of planning and sensitivity into how we would approach acknowledging the anniversary when it would occur on a school day. Now, for us, that wouldn't happen until the 3 year mark. Our first anniversary was on a Saturday. The next day of remembrance, as we called it, would be on a Sunday, and then the third would be the first time that we had to make this decision in school. So we did have the benefit of a little bit of time. But again, it's something that requires a team of multiple disciplines and stakeholders to begin to think about. I just want to end here by pointing to more resources to let you know that you can reach back to Safe and Sound Schools and explore many of the resources related to this conversation today, as well as lots of other programs that we offer at no cost. As I mentioned, the National Resilience Institute and several of their programs that will be of interest, as well as NASPonline.org, where there are so many resources that you really do need to use that little search box and search the terms memorials and anniversaries to delve into those things. So I hope that gives you at least a little bit of insight into some of the lessons that we learned within our community, and how that might hopefully help inform you in your planning and preparing to support your community if the need ever be, whether the crisis is smaller in scale or larger in scale, whether it happens to be very quiet and community-wide, or whether it happens to be something that becomes very public as as our crisis was. So with that, I'm going to hand off now. I'm going to hand back to Christina to share several of her lessons learned and experiences and resources. Christina?
Thank you, Michelle, so much. Yes, as you know, a lot of what you said definitely resonated with our community as well. I will just add a quick plug. Some of you are adding questions as well. Please submit questions to the Q&A. If we're not able to answer all of them, the webinar, Michelle and I and the REMCA Center team will be happy to connect offline as well. Just to echo the wonderful point that Michelle made as well. Yes, I'm speaking from a student perspective. I was halfway through my college career when our shooting on April 16th, 2007 occurred. I went directly into the hospital for about a week, and so I was not, privy to a lot of the immediate, as Michelle also mentioned, the media that descended upon our campus and the many spontaneous memorials that occurred. But even thinking about that in our recovery, there were many individuals at our nearby hospital that kept politicians and the media and well-meaning members of clergy from gaining access to my room. As Michelle mentioned, I just want to kind of briefly say, political dignitaries and all those different things are, of course, one of those are very large logistical things to plan for, but just not to assume that the survivor or the family always wants to meet with that person in the moment. I recovered at my parents' home for the next few months, and I came back to boxes of cards and flowers and blankets, and in some ways it was actually quite helpful to be able to go through that at my own pace versus directly there, kind of faced with the individual. I want to share with you a little bit. I'm sure many of you recall the events that happened in our campus. In 2007. But one of the most important things, for all communities to recover as they heal is to come back to a space where people feel close and together and unified and bonded. I really want to stress that our community, we already were a very close-knit space. Virginia Tech is a large campus. It's a rural campus. We're about 4 hours south of Washington, D.C. Academics, research, sports, football were already very big unifiers for our space. I know that many professors, this happened towards the end of the semester. They took different approaches. All were quite understanding with, being careful with grades and working around classroom assignments. From what I heard anecdotally from many of my friends, many did return to the classroom. They may not really have done the same type of work. They may have spoken about where they were that day, their experiences, but everyone kind of, got, pretty good grades that they were able to pick at the time. There were about 17 of us physically injured survivors who, survived the event. We all came back to Virginia Tech to finish out our education. And these themes became very important, initially in our recovery and long term. So Ut Prosim is our school motto. It means that I may serve. We are Virginia Tech Hokies United. December 32, and that we lost 30 members of our faculty and staff and students that day. It is very, very symbolic, and we will prevail. Over time, and I'll share with this, a little later as well. Some of these, some of the families may have thought, or parents, that some of this meant that we were moving onwards and possibly forgetting their children and things like that. So I know I did a lot behind the scenes to make sure that, there was a balance of support and commemoration that was appropriate. And so, as Michelle mentioned as well, we appreciate all the work that you're doing, and one of the hardest things about this work is knowing that it will be hard to please everyone, and that we can just do our best to take in as much input and make the best decision for our larger communities. We had, for the survivors, what was called Office of Recovery and Support, which is actually still in place today. This was funded by a Department of Justice grant and some other couple networks, and it was a staff of counselors, therapists, outreach individuals that really worked with the survivors that returned to campus to help us make sure that our professors were informed to be, expecting some potential trauma reactions and triggers, working with family liaisons and building connections and things like that. Obviously, what's really important in the immediate sense is information sharing and knowing where to, pick up the blankets that were left for you, or the flowers and different things like that. Hokies United was is a student group that really led a lot of our initial memorial construction and student activism. And so the main point of that is obviously please don't forget your students and existing groups that, as Michelle mentioned, they want a place to give and be involved because they're also grieving in the process. A lot of what the Office of Recovery and Support did, and this office still exists, they're part of Alumni Relations, we still receive communication from them on a pretty regular basis, was involving the families in the memorial process, and family members were invited to speak at vigils and different events if they chose to. There was always a deep respect for privacy and different things like that. One of the most, for me, helpful things that occurred was the ability to reconnect with first responders at different picnics and community events, as time went on. You have to understand, for many of us, we were plucked out of this space and may or may not have returned quickly, giving us a chance to grieve, and a thank you was a really helpful thing to do. If you're curious, there's a website that called weremember.vt.edu there at the bottom of the screen, which has bios of our different fallen Hokies, community events that are happening across the country, and different things. The photograph to the right actually is not from a vigil related to our shooting, but if many of you might recall, in 2008 there was a mass tragedy at Northern Illinois University, and because it happened in such close proximity and obviously the connection of higher education, many of our students felt very connected to that event. And so our president spoke. There was a large vigil on campus, and so understanding that, depending on the timing of the event, you're going to feel, multiple things at once. We were slightly unique in that we did have a very quick memorial. I believe this was dedicated by the fall or the year after of the shooting, so it was fairly quick. It is 32 Hokie stones. Our mascot is the Hokies. That stone, that quarry, is very kind of important and symbolic to Virginia Tech, one for each of the individuals who lost their lives that day. Norris Hall, where the shooting took place, actually, you can kind of see it in the photograph, is a small building to the right of the screen. The hallway where the shooting took place is now the Center for Peace Studies and Violence Prevention, as well as a global technology hub. And so, again, a lot of discussions with families and victims and survivors of what is appropriate in that space. There is a plaque that is not, you can't really see it in the photograph, that serves as an educational piece of the bios of the families, of the victims and survivors, and just seeks to educate people in the long term what took place. As a quick kind of reminder, being very thoughtful of the fact that everyone as a survivor was there in that space, and so there are two benches that kind of flank the memorial, and there's a photograph there if you're interested in what that looks like. Virginia Tech received as an institution about 90,000 pieces of unique artwork, cards, flowers, original, music composers and things like that. And so as you can imagine, this was quite a lot of work to bring this all together. And our university archivist, Tamara Kennelly, and her team actually digitalized all of this. And so if you're interested, the link below will take you to where some of those images are. As part of our ongoing memorials, anniversaries, they will bring some of these artifacts back out. I believe this was a 10-year anniversary that's pictured here. These were large boards placed all around campus that people wrote different messages of condolence. There's actually a photograph of Miss Tamara Kennelly, and one thing that she found out a couple years afterwards was the students of Marjorie Stoneblink Douglas High School, the class of 2007, sent us this very large book with different notes from students across the country of concern and caring and healing, and obviously very tragic with what would occur many years after to them. But so that we were just very appreciative. We received letters from Columbine High School, just across the world, and so those are digitalized in this web portal called Communities of Caring. If that is of interest to you to see how they did that. From an ongoing perspective, providing opportunities for students, whether they were on campus or not, whether, this, as you can imagine, obviously impacted our alumni and people that came back as well, was very, very important. And so in the long term, in the initial sense, we did not have class on April 16th. We do today. They've returned courses. But community picnics, we already had a really large volunteer called Big Event that was established, but this is kind of rerouted into this theme of remembering April 16th, providing visuals and interfaith services as appropriate, these small educational exhibits that would bring back some of those different cards and things that were sent. The run is one of the biggest things that has really united our campus. It's 3.2 for 32 lives that were lost. The photograph that you're seeing there on the right was actually only about 2 years ago. And so on the anniversary, large flowers are brought out for each of the stones on the birthdays of the there will be a small flower and a note there that is brought out as well. For opportunities for people to participate virtually, what I meant by that was I actually interviewed students that were part of a community college shooting that happened years afterwards. And one of them spoke, she transferred and went to a different school afterwards. And sometimes the loneliness and the awkwardness of being in a new space where no one quite understands what that day might or that week might mean to you. Her school offered a virtual run, and so you could print out a bib and run a 5K in your own community. She felt like that was a very helpful way to be able to honor and not have to, very bluntly in that space. One thing before I forget, I also want to say it on the previous slide, is being very thoughtful of inclusive recovery and thinking about all of our first responders. So many of our responders that stayed on campus at Virginia Tech had to work during the anniversary. So thinking about our dispatchers, our EMS, obviously our law enforcement, maybe the actual anniversary isn't always the best time for them to have these reconnections, but making sure that we're thinking about them in our planning as well. On the long term, again, depending on the community, people might change and they might move away and come back. And the biggest thing that I would point out about planning, as we mentioned, is being thoughtful of trauma reactions ahead of time, not using verbiage as, again, oh, wish you were there, or shouldn't she be over it, and things like that. But the biggest one is that we may have new leadership, faculty, staff that come into the space that weren't there during the event, and they may not understand why that day or that week is so important to the community. So just taking it upon themselves to educate them about actually what transpired, possibly giving them some kind of debriefing, but also preparing them so that they don't inadvertently say something that might be unthoughtful, increase course workload or things like that, and create potentially painful situation for the student or the faculty member as well. A couple quick resources. The Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, led by Dr. David Schoenfeld and his team, has done some really wonderful work on how to speak to children about crisis and loss and bereavement, and to parents and faculty as well. And so they provide training, on different times and lengths of how to approach that, looking from everything from school shootings to terrorism to suicide, different things like that. Their website has some short videos that you can use as well. And the book on the left is just a really nice guide for how to approach what we all know can be a very difficult topic to speak about. Ashley Maynor was on our campus at Virginia Tech in 2007, and she has studied not only Virginia Tech, but also Sandy Hook and various other events, looking at from the archivist, librarian perspective of all the different things that are sent, the cranes, the cards, all those different wonderful symbolic donations, and looking at how can we better route those from an emergency management perspective. And so the Story of the Stuff is a web documentary where she visits some of those sites, but she's also created book chapters and tips and handouts that are available there on the website if you are interested. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much. We look forward to all of your questions. And I just want to acknowledge that I understand this is sometimes very difficult work, and we appreciate you all taking the time and being willing to engage on this, because you never know the impact that you'll have on life. So thank you.
And thank you, Christina. Thank you, Christina, and to Michelle. So now we're going to speak very, very briefly to integrating this topic of memorials and anniversaries and remembrance ceremonies into our school EOP, or our higher ed EOP. So as the school or the higher ed campus decides whether to hold activities to commemorate the anniversary of a past trauma, using a trauma-informed approach means allowing for students and staff and their families, that whole school community, and that community that serves them, to show remembrance in their own way, while also having input into that educational entity's planning. So the schools are going to need to be responsive in the moment. They can also be in planning in advance with their partners and their school community. And they can integrate this topic, memorials and remembrances and anniversaries, into that EOP through the recovery annex or independently through a sole annex dedicated to this. And that means they're going to work together to create policies and put forth key considerations and do some advanced designing of resources and supports. And this is also going to help clarify some of the roles and responsibilities in advance, and hopefully build those necessary relationships if they're not there. So as we heard from both Michelle and Christina, planning for and allowing for memorials it's important, it's sensitive, it's valuable, it's meaningful, and it can also take a long time. Furthermore, it's going to carry implications far into the future, and some of the circumstances may change over time. So to make a permanent memorial, as we just heard, takes a lot of consideration, and along that line, we need to also remember that concept of re-traumatization. So we are then also going to be talking about some activities, some alternatives that are alternatives to those permanent memorials. So memorial activities provide the opportunity for people to come together and express their emotions. And then at the same time, they symbolize something about that every student and staff member is important, and it helps to unite and strengthen those that were impacted by the death, and so that they can also help to strengthen one another. So as the planning committee is working, they should also be considering alternatives, and all along the planning process, be sensitive and keep in mind the different cultural needs, especially in regards to rituals and traditions and beliefs. So we have there's a few options for memorial activities, and as you just heard, there's so many different ways to do these very important events. So never feel limited. We just wanted to point out a few of the more positive ones. And so there's scholarship, creating scholarship opportunities or long-term foundations to receive gifts and donations, planting trees and including plaques and such. And as we all just heard, they are very meaningful to everyone for years to come. So Michelle and Christina shared with us some of the many feelings they were having as they were experiencing the anniversaries and planning for the anniversaries, and some of the things that the community did together and they did independently or with their families. So it's always going to be helpful if you plan in advance some of the things to protect the school community so they can have their personal time together. And one of the important things is establishing guidelines with the media and then working with our partners to help keep those in place. And then the whole discussion as to whether or not to hold school on the anniversary, or as we heard with Michelle, if school isn't taking place that day, whether or not to have an alternative activity that brings together the school community. There are numerous considerations, and so that's another reason we encourage you to think about it in advance. So I'm just going to check in one more time with Michelle and see if she wanted to share any more lessons learned in regards to planning for anniversaries, memorials, and remembrance occasions. Michelle?
Thank you. I think we've all spoken and touched on the managing of donations as an incredible feat. I think, especially when these are sort of widely publicized events and tragedies. So as I mentioned, one really powerful sort of discovery or plan that we were able to kind of make up as we were going through this was the incineration of the remaining items that just didn't have a place or a home, or people just weren't able to keep them. In my home in Massachusetts, I was continuing to go and pick up boxes from Newtown and bringing them home to process. It was almost like a part-time job, and it would take me 2.5 years before I really got got the situation under control. Those boxes occupied my 2-car garage for a very, very long time. But the idea that our selectmen came up with to incinerate those articles and fold them into the long-term memorial, the ground there, that was something that was valuable and has proved to resonate with a lot of the other communities that we have worked with. We had warehouses, donated warehouses to help us process these things as well. We had to learn to say no, but it really was very much an emergency management function. And so to be able to tap into those resources in your community now, again, on a good day, and think about those things and develop your plan for handling those or knowing that you do have permission to say no, those are really important things I would love our communities to know about today. Another thing that we didn't really anticipate in terms of its trauma impact was all of the memorial goods that were in and around our community. Again, born out of an act or a desire to show solidarity and support. There were T-shirts being made, there were hats and rubber bracelets and the ribbons and the stickers and the car magnets, all of those things, as you can imagine. And they were amazing. It was kind of breathtaking initially to see them literally everywhere. But I know just in the month that I was there, immediately following the tragedy in town, it was difficult to finally get up the courage to step outside of my house and get into the car and maybe go and try to do something normal, like, get some groceries or pick up dry cleaning, or just trying to sort of plug into some of those activities again, how very difficult it was to see all of those reminders. And I'm going to share an anecdote from one of the other mothers who lost a child. She shared about, having to work up the courage and all the work it took her to get out to the gym finally. And, she gets there for her class, and she's ready and she's feeling really good and positive. She's been successful at this point. And then, she looks up and the class begins, and every woman in front of her has a shirt on, a T-shirt on that says something about, the tragedy, the names of all of our loved ones. And again, all of these things were done with a desire to support, but very difficult for her, and, resulted in her just walking out of the class. So really thinking about those things, and also thinking about, putting the names of people's precious loved ones on these articles, and, what happens to those articles when you're done with them. How are they going to be discarded? Are they going to be discarded? These are things that were difficult for a lot of our families of loss, and as a result, also for a lot of our community members. So important to think about. Of course, lots of organizations were established quickly in our community, unprecedented to my knowledge, just hundreds of them. Again, all with good intentions, but, collecting a lot of money, sort of duplicating one another's efforts, kind of a lack of organization around that. It would also be difficult in terms of distribution of funds that they were collecting. What were the rules of the road? As we talked about a little bit earlier, how were these things going to be collected and distributed in the best possible, most sensitive way? Those were all very, very difficult issues for our families, our community to be dealing with while suffering and going through this painful process of initial recovery. So, having that plan today, thinking about, if ever you are experiencing a crisis or tragedy that results in, the donations, the money coming in, to be very, very clear about where it goes and how it will be distributed. Those things are very important and can save your community a lot of unnecessary pain and trauma, for sure. I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing that. And thank you also, Christina, again, for sharing some considerations related to donations and volunteer management. And for some education agencies and their community partners, creating a memorial or commemorating an anniversary is going to present that need to create systems and or warehouses, as Michelle mentioned, or other storage facilities to receive and to track all of these goods and information, and then also to manage the students and community volunteers who are signing up to support the variety of activities that are going to be hosted around these memorials and anniversary dates. And so it's very important, as Michelle just mentioned, that school and campus safety teams, when dealing with spontaneous or unplanned volunteers and donations, have a donations and volunteer management plan set up in place that is going to help them manage information, goods, facilities and transportation, volunteers and services, money, as Michelle mentioned, and all of those operational tasks involved with managing donations and volunteers. And we have some recommendations here on the screen that describe procedures that you want to perhaps consider as you're developing this plan, and some that are relevant to a school or IHE's unique situation. And some of those considerations are how to protect and ensure the safety of students while volunteers are on school and campus, thinking about how things will be distributed and managed, who will be involved in that process, what systems and tools will be used, and then, of course, how to communicate with all of those individuals who are going to play a key role. And thinking about who those individuals and entities might be, that's going to be another aspect of your donations and volunteer management plan that should be included in your overall EOP. And so thinking about who is going to support you with that donation and volunteer management process. And that might include state and local emergency management agencies, of course, community-based organizations and faith-based organizations and VOADs and in some cases citizen corps as well. As with all emergency planning efforts, it's important to consider, as we talked about before, the 5 preparedness mission areas that together contribute to overall preparedness. And then also to think about this planning from the considerations of before, during, and after. And so thinking about before, during, and after, there are a lot of considerations that you're probably going to want to talk about in collaboration with your planning team, including creating MOUs and MOAs, designating key points of contact on the state, local, territorial, and federal level, getting training on the incident management system, and of course developing systems to support information management. During an emergency, you're going to think about activating that plan. And the first thing that emergency response teams at education agencies should consider when a major threat or hazard happens or when a memorial or anniversary event is coming up is activating that donations and volunteer management annex. Also want to make sure that those needs are communicated clearly and that inventory and tracking requirements are outlined in advance. And also knowing which departments within the school district, or institution of higher education are going to be needed to support the overall process. And then after a memorial or anniversary, it's a good idea to take a look at the donations and volunteer management plan to consider how it can be updated in response to any considerations or lessons learned each year. So those are just some considerations that we really encourage you to think about as you continue to plan and as you continue to revise and enhance your emergency operations plans to consider managing and planning for memorials and anniversaries. We're going to take some time now to go quickly over some questions that we did receive from participants, and then we will go over to our community of practice where we will commence our live web chat. So I'm going to start with the first question, and Michelle and Christina, I encourage you both to provide an answer if you would like. Can you share any details about how students themselves participated in planning memorials and anniversary commemorations? And Christina, this might be something that you can speak to as a former student and perhaps can talk about the importance of involving students in that process. Christina?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Actually, even the construction of our memorial, and again, I wasn't there fully because I was recovering, but I think I have quite a bit of the story. We have a rock quarry near Virginia Tech where a lot of our buildings are built from. So they essentially borrowed, stole the rocks that became the different 32 stones that were placed there. So it was literally a student-led creation that they placed on the grass and in honor of the two fallen Hokies within a few days. And this was really done by members of our Student Government Association, and I'm sure others that they brought in. Those, because it's placed in such a central part of our campus, it's on this large, it's called the drill field. This is a large space of green grass. This became, one of the places where many people, came to leave things, to mourn. The university also set up tables with the names of each of the victims where people could write notes or leave flowers and different things, as Michelle spoke. I mean, there was just so much that people sent or brought and left. And so, I mean, I think this partially led to why we did have a memorial so quickly, in that you couldn't move those 32 once they had established their significance in our community. From a kind of longer perspective, Virginia Tech, our Office of Recovery and Support, very actively included students, both those that were, very closely connected to the tragedy and others that were in leadership roles to participate. We had meetings of what would be appropriate for the different anniversaries, because if you remember or, can understand, we still had survivors that were on campus for about 2-3 years, and they really showed a commitment to making sure everyone was taken care of, throughout their time on campus. We had members of SGA and other, different community student groups that spoke during the vigil. So they would alternate reading the names of the victims as a candle was being lit in their honor. And even today, I mean, a lot of students, they write op-eds, they do research, they, take on different movements. As I mentioned, big events, the volunteering group was really student-led as well. So I think the biggest thing is to understand that, this is going to impact all of your students, everyone that was there, and possibly your alumni as well, because there is such that emotional connection to the institution that we really appreciate. I'll be traveling around spaces and you'll see the orange and maroon shirts. Those are our colors. We have the ribbon, the VT that, as Michelle mentioned as well, can be a reminder sometimes, but is also a really nice visual to see as you travel across. So students were a huge part of that. If that answers your question, Janelle.
Yes, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Michelle, I just want to turn things to you in case you have anything additional you'd like to add to that conversation.
Yeah, it was very different actually in our community. As you can imagine, a lot of our students were school-age students, so we're talking about kindergarten through 12th grade. And so I think initially, out of concern and just being unsure and unaware about what the impact would be on students, incorporating them within school in memorial activities, there was a lot of trepidation. It was a slow progression in that direction. Mostly students and children were engaging in memorial activities in town with their families, visiting the various memorial sites around, cropping up around town, cutting snowflakes and engaging in crafts and things like that. As a former teacher, I would have really liked to see more activities for the students around that. At my daughter's funeral service afterwards at the reception, we had a Christmas tree, and we had all of the children had the opportunity to decorate ornaments and place them on the tree, sharing memories, things like that. Those were very important to our youngsters as they were processing this whole experience and this new reality. So, but initially those kinds of activities were taking place. They were family-led, they were neighborhood-led. It would take time, I think, before the schools felt educated enough, felt comfortable enough to step into that. So over time, those types of activities certainly have increased, and we see our students becoming more active. Even some of our students now, acting in leadership roles and sharing their experiences publicly, participating in various publications and books, and involved in different causes. So those types of things. That's kind of how our journey went. We did have children from outside of our community pretty successfully incorporated. The Connecticut PTA organized a snowflake campaign, which this resonated so strongly with me as a former elementary school teacher and with young surviving children of my own. But when my fourth grade daughter went back to the new Sandy Hook school at another building that had been donated by a nearby town, the whole school was covered in these beautiful snowflakes that children from all over the country had mailed in, and it was just a very loving, wonderful, warm gesture to say that we recognize, we see you, we're sending our love and our prayers to all of you. So it's very important to think about those things now.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, Michelle. Very powerful. And I think that is a great segue into the next question. As you talked about how involving students, the process of involving students itself evolved over time. So I'm hoping that you and Christina can talk a little bit about how your community's approaches to managing memorials and anniversaries have changed over the years. And so you've shared, about how it's changed in terms of involving youth. But have you any insight to share on perhaps how approaches have changed in any other ways? Christina, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me think about that for a second. I think one of the challenges has been figuring out, and again, I want to speak, from my perspective. I'm the beneficiary of what they're doing, of what the university is putting together in the community, is how much to do. I know communities, other ones, also think about questions of how many years do you acknowledge? The Columbine High School, Littleton, Colorado community just, marked and honored their 20-year anniversary as well. And I think Virginia has chosen the sense of, in our community, of keeping contact. I was not able to attend the 5K in our campus this year, just because I live in Seattle, Washington now, and it's a little bit far to get back to college. But I still received T-shirts and the run bibs that students were given on campus there in the mail, and that kind of point of touch. Obviously very appreciative for as long as it goes on, but there's a lot of consideration of who will do that work in the long term. And I think one thing, I'm not sure if we've directly addressed it, but even self-care for the individuals that do the work themselves, they would come out to different, if the family lived in a different city or town, as many of us did, they would travel and meet with us in person, and just when does it go between being a job and being a personal commitment, and just making sure that person's taken care of as well. And I think also culturally, this is something that, I can kind of speak to, but it's a sense of, not every community always wants to be known and identified as the place where XYZ occurred. So I think it's, very thoughtful in how we think about these things, and remember that there's resiliency and growth and strength to all these spaces, and that they're not only known as, the ways that people sometimes call us, the site of the worst, different, mass shooting and things like that. So it's really a balance of how much of our history do we make this? Do we lead with this? And I think that every community will approach that question differently, and time will tell. But I think that my personal sense is that it's important to do something and to acknowledge it, because that's how we help ensure that it doesn't happen again.
Thank you so much, Christina. And thank you for mentioning again just resilience and compassion fatigue and the need for self-care. And if you're going to join us on the web chat, we can share details about a free training that the REMTA Center offers to schools and school districts on the topics of resilience strategies for educators. And we talk specifically about development of those self-care plans. But Michelle, I want to turn things to you in case you have anything to add in response to that question.
I would echo a lot of what Christina said. I think, each community is just so very different. Our community, this tragedy happened in a community where, where there was a community of residents, right? So there's a little bit less, transience as you might have, in a university setting. So I think initially, the focus was very much on victims' families, and I think as a result, some of our survivors, in the community, and folks that just were in the community experiencing various levels of trauma, of impacts from the tragedy, just weren't really sure how much they could speak about their experiences and what was okay. And if I speak up about it, am I, trying somehow to compare what I'm going through to what someone else has gone through who maybe lost a loved one or who was physically injured. So that had been a struggle for us. I often talk about our community post-tragedy as a bit being like the walking wounded. Everybody was wounded in some way, and those wounds were not visible. So it was really easy, even in trying to do something really positive, to inadvertently have a negative effect on someone else. So that has been a unique challenge to a community that, is living together, literally living together through this many, many years later. So I think what I see in terms of the change is that people are beginning to find their voice and test their voice in various ways. Some people are moving out of town. That's what they need to do, or changing, their life up in some way. Some of our educators have moved on to other school communities or other lines of work. We have discovered that sometimes people need to, since they're not the same anymore, need to find some way of reinventing themselves. So yeah, I think that's what we see, and it's a lifelong journey. I think for all of us and for our community, there's not going to be a moment in time where we can say, oh, we finished the journey, we're done. There won't be that date on the calendar. So it just continues to evolve, and we continue to try to learn and be aware and conscious of one another, and how our actions, however well intended, may have traumatic impact upon any number of other people within our community and beyond.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Awesome points and great considerations. And I think one of the important lessons learned is that this is an evolving process, and that this is something that takes careful consideration in collaboration with key community partners and members of the whole school community. At this time, we are going to go over onto our community of practice to continue the conversation with our webinar presenters. You will see a link to the Community of Practice forum via the Q&A box. We want to thank everyone so much for your time today, including Christina Anderson and Michelle Gay. We appreciate your collaboration and everything that you do for the field of school and higher ed safety. This does conclude our webinar. We encourage you to follow the REMCA Center on Twitter at REMCA Center to get daily updates on key topics and on school and higher ed safety and emergency preparedness. You can also contact us by email at info@remcacenter.org and by phone at our toll-free hotline 1-855-781-7367. Thank you so much for your time today.